At 27,000 feet above Kassel, Germany, on July 30th, 1943, the temperature in the tail of a B-17 bomber remained near -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft was part of a large formation penetrating deep into German airspace. The bomber was designated B-17 number 42-29,896, assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces. Its position in the formation placed it directly in the path German fighters preferred. The tail. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth sat alone in the rear compartment, sealed inside a plexiglass enclosure that offered visibility but little protection. His hands rested on the grips of two .50 caliber Browning machine guns. Despite electrically heated gloves, his fingers were numb. Oxygen flowed through a mask that pressed tightly against his face. Any failure in that system would lead to confusion, then unconsciousness, then death. Through the curved glass behind him, Aruth watched German fighters forming up dot. They did not approach at random. They gathered deliberately, 8, then 10, then more. Messerschmitt fighters aligned themselves behind the bomber stream, holding position, adjusting spacing, waiting for the moment to attack. The formation moved with intent, not urgency. They were not reacting. They were preparing. The intercom crackled. The pilot asked if Aruth could see them. He answered calmly that he could. According to Army Air Force's gunnery doctrine, what was about to happen followed a known pattern. German fighters would close to between 400 and 600 yards. At that range, bomber gunners were trained to open fire using calculated deflection, short bursts, conserved ammunition, controlled heat buildup. The manuals were explicit. Firing earlier was considered wasteful. Firing longer was considered undisciplined. Those rules assumed that the bomber would survive long enough for them to matter by mid-1943. Evidence suggested otherwise. Bomber losses over Europe had reached unsustainable levels. During a single week in October, known later as Black Week, more than 100 heavy bombers had been destroyed. Thousands of aircrew were killed, wounded, or captured. The mathematics were simple. At prevailing loss rates, the bomber force could not survive long enough to achieve its objectives. The aircraft themselves were not fragile. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns and a crew of 10. It had been designed to defend itself through concentrated firepower. Engineers believed that massed formations would create overlapping fields of fire strong, enough to repel fighter attacks. That belief depended on one assumption, that the guns would hit something. After-action analysis told a different story. Gun. Camera footage and combat reports showed that fewer than 2% of rounds fired by bomber gunners struck attacking fighters. German pilots had adapted. They attacked from angles where defensive fire was weakest. They attacked at speeds that compressed engagement windows to fractions of seconds. They fired first and broke away before gunners could track them effectively. Doctrine did not adjust quickly. Training continued to emphasize regulation engagement ranges. Gunnery instructors reinforced textbook principles derived from ballistics, tables, and controlled testing. These principles were mathematically sound. They were also detached from the conditions inside a bomber under attack. Aruth had seen this gap repeatedly. He was 23 years old. He weighed little more than 130 pounds. He was called the Kid by older crewmen because he looked younger than his age. He had no advanced education. He had dropped out of technical school years earlier to work. His role aboard the bomber was narrowly defined. Watch the rear. Fire when told. Follow the book. He had followed it. On previous missions, he waited for enemy fighters to reach the prescribed range. He applied deflection as taught. He fired controlled bursts. He watched tracers pass through empty space while German cannon fire tore through bombers ahead of him. He watched aircraft explode. He watched men fall out of the sky. The manuals said this was correct. The results suggested otherwise. As the fighters behind the formation closed distance on July 30th, Aruth did not move to open fire. His hands remained on the grips. The sight picture stayed centered. He counted seconds rather than yards. He watched the attackers stabilize their aircraft, lining up their shots, preparing to fire. He understood something the doctrine did not address. At the regulation firing range, the German pilot was already in position. He was no longer maneuvering. He was executing. The bomber absorbed damage before its gunner even engaged. That moment was irreversible. Aruth had reached a conclusion, grounded not in theory, but observation. If the attacker controlled the timing, the defender was already too late. The fighters continued to close at approximately 900 yards. Well outside the authorized range, Aruth squeezed the triggers. The machine guns roared to life, sending streams of tracer fire into the space the German pilots expected to be safe. The rounds did not need hit. They needed to force reaction. What followed would challenge assumptions built into aerial gunnery training across the entire 8th Air Force. According to United States Army Air Force's gunnery doctrine in mid-1943, the action Michael Aruth had just taken was incorrect. Bomber defensive fire was governed by range discipline. Gunnery manuals specified that opening fire beyond 600 yards was ineffective. At that distance, dispersion of 50 caliber rounds increased sharply. Tracer visibility created a false sense of accuracy. Heat buildup risked gun jams. Ammunition expenditure rose without measurable effect. Gunners were instructed to wait until attackers committed to their firing run. This doctrine was built on controlled testing. Ballistic tables showed that at long range the probability of a hit dropped close to zero. Training films reinforced this conclusion repeatedly. Early firing was described as panic fire. Panic fire revealed position, wasted ammunition, and reduced effectiveness during the critical final seconds of an attack. Doctrine assumed that the bomber would survive until that final window. By 1943, that assumption was increasingly fragile. German fighter tactics had evolved in direct response to bomber formations. Fighters no longer lingered in defensive fire zones. They approached from blind angles. They fired heavy cannon at long range. They broke away before defensive fire could concentrate. From a mechanical standpoint, the German approach exploited bomber limitations. AB-17 at cruise speed could not maneuver sharply. Its defensive guns required time to traverse and settle. Each gun was operated manually, subject to vibration, cold, oxygen deprivation, and human reaction delay. At -40 degrees, fine motor control degraded. Vision narrowed. Judgment. Slowed. German pilots understood this. They stabilized their aircraft before firing. They aligned their guns carefully. They fired first. Even a single 20-millimeter shell could cripple a bomber. Control cables, fuel tanks, oxygen systems, and crew stations were all vulnerable. Doctrine treated this as acceptable risk. The bomber force was designed to absorb losses. Survivability was statistical, not individual. If enough bombers reached the target, the mission was considered successful regardless of casualties. This logic extended to gunnery. Defensive fire was meant to discourage attacks over time, not necessarily stop every one. Individual bomber survival was secondary to formation survival. Gunnery doctrine reflected this by prioritizing discipline over improvisation. Aruth's early firing violated that discipline. From an engineering perspective, his action should not have worked. At 900 yards, bullet drop was significant. Time of flight exceeded 1 second. A fighter moving at high speed could change position completely during that interval. Wind effects, slipstream turbulence, and vibration further reduced accuracy. The chance of scoring a hit was negligible. Doctrine treated negligible as meaningless. But doctrine measured success only in hits. It did not account for reaction. Fighter pilot entering an attack expected a predictable environment. He expected bombers to hold fire until regulation range. He planned his approach accordingly. His firing solution depended on that timing. Any deviation disrupted his calculations. Early fire forced immediate decisions. If the fighter pressed on, he risked flying through sustained fire for longer than planned. If he broke off, the attack failed. Either choice altered the engagement. Geometry. Doctrine did not include this variable. It assumed that defensive fire was a terminal event, not a shaping one. It assumed that deterrence occurred through lethality, not disruption. This assumption held during early stages of the war, when fighters approached slowly and bomber formations were tighter. By 1943, German tactics had changed faster than bomber doctrine. Aruth's conclusion emerged from repeated observation. He had watched bombers wait until regulation range and die. He had watched German fighters fire unopposed during the most stable phase of their attack. He understood that by the time doctrine allowed engagement, the outcome was often already decided. From a probability standpoint, early firing made little sense. From a tactical standpoint, it altered timing. The impossibility lay here. A single-tail gunner firing well outside authorized range should not have influenced the outcome of an attack. He lacked accuracy. He lacked firepower concentration. He lacked authority to change engagement rules. Yet he had introduced uncertainty. German fighter doctrine emphasized efficiency. Pilots were trained to avoid unnecessary exposure. They did not expect defensive fire at extended range. When it appeared, it challenged their assumptions. The manuals on both sides were aligned in one belief, that bomber gunners reacted to fighters. Aruth reversed that relationship. According to doctrine, such behavior should have resulted in wasted ammunition and reduced defense. It should have made the bomber more vulnerable later in the attack. What followed would determine whether the doctrine's assumptions about timing and control still held under combat conditions that no longer resembled the testing environment on which they were built. Michael Aruth did not arrive in the Army Air Forces with any expectation of combat distinction. He was born into a working-class family and left school early to earn a living. Before the war, his days were spent on factory floors and in repair shops, performing repetitive mechanical tasks that demanded attention rather than creativity. His hands learned routine before theory. He did not study ballistics. He did not read tactical manuals beyond what training required. When he entered the service, he was assigned to gunnery because his eyesight met requirements and his mechanical aptitude suggested he could maintain weapons under stress. The position of tail gunner carried little prestige. It was isolated, physically demanding, and widely considered the most dangerous station aboard a bomber. Aruth did not request it. Tail gunners operated alone, cut off from the rest of the crew by fuselage length and noise. Communication was limited to intercom reports. In combat, survival depended on early detection and precise timing. The gunner had no armor beyond thin aluminum skin and plexiglass. There was no escape hatch large enough to exit quickly if the aircraft was damaged. Training emphasized obedience to procedure. At gunnery school, Aruth learned deflection shooting through repetitive drills. Targets towed behind aircraft simulated attackers crossing predictable arcs. Engagement ranges were fixed. Instructors corrected students who fired early. Ammunition conservation was stressed constantly. Overheating guns caused jams. Jams during attack meant death. The doctrine was clear and enforced. Aruth qualified within acceptable margins. He was not an exceptional shot. His instructors did not single him out. His reports described him as steady and reliable. Those traits mattered more than raw accuracy. When he joined his combat crew, his role was defined narrowly. Watch the rear hemisphere. Call out contacts. Fire when ordered. Do not panic. Do not freelance. His first missions followed that pattern. German fighters attacked in disciplined formations. They approached from behind and below, exploiting blind spots. Aruth waited until regulation range and fired as trained. He watched tracers converge on empty air while cannon shells tore into bombers ahead. He watched aircraft break apart. He listened to the intercom fall silent as crewmen were killed. After each mission, instructors reviewed gun camera footage. Hits were rare. Doctrine remained unchanged. Aruth did not argue. He did not file complaints. He did not question instructors. He absorbed what he saw and adjusted internally. Over successive missions, a pattern became clear. German fighters stabilized their approach long before entering authorized firing range. Their aircraft stopped maneuvering. Their nose alignment became precise. At that moment, the bomber was already vulnerable. Waiting preserved discipline, but ceded initiative. Aruth began experimenting mentally, not physically. He asked himself what the German pilot expected. He watched how fighters reacted. When bombers fired irregularly, he noticed hesitation when tracers appeared unexpectedly. He noticed attacks breaking off earlier than planned. He did not discuss these observations with officers. There was no forum for it. Tail gunners did not contribute to doctrine. They executed it. By July 1943, Aruth had flown enough missions to understand that regulation procedure did not guarantee survival. It guaranteed consistency. Consistency favored the attacker. The decision he made on July 30th was not sudden. It was incremental. He did not reject training. He reinterpreted its purpose. The goal was to prevent the attacker from executing a stable firing run. If that could be done earlier, accuracy became secondary. This reasoning was not theoretical. It was practical. At 900 yards, his rounds were unlikely to hit. He knew that, but tracers were visible at that distance. They created a volume of threat rather than a point of impact. They forced reaction. Aruth did not believe he was improving lethality. He believed he was disrupting timing. He understood the cost. Early firing increased ammunition expenditure. It risked overheating. It risked jamming later. If the attack continued, he might be defenseless. He accepted that trade-off. His decision was grounded in the same logic that governed all bomber operations. Sacrifice precision for effect. Trade individual efficiency for collective survival. At that moment, he was not attempting to rewrite doctrine. He was attempting to survive the next 30 seconds. The fighters continued to close. Aruth held the triggers down longer than manuals allowed. The guns vibrated violently. The plexiglass enclosure filled with noise and flashing light. Tracers extended outward in long arcs, filling the space the attackers intended to occupy. German fighters reacted. Some broke formation. Others altered approach angles. One rolled inverted and pulled away sharply. The attack lost coherence. The bomber remained intact. What followed would determine whether disruption alone could substitute for regulation lethality, and whether a single gunner's deviation could influence an engagement designed to overwhelm. The German fighters did not press their original attack. As Aruth continued firing, the formation behind the bomber stream began to fragment. Instead of a single coordinated approach, individual aircraft reacted independently. Some rolled away to regain spacing. Others climbed to reposition. The clean geometry of the attack dissolved. This mattered. German fighter doctrine relied on timing and stability. Pilots were trained to line up carefully, fire heavy cannon at close range, and break away before defensive fire could concentrate. That sequence required predictability. When tracer fire appeared earlier than expected, the sequence broke down. Aruth adjusted his fire. He did not track individual aircraft. He swept the guns across the space behind the bomber, maintaining a continuous stream rather than short bursts. This violated training guidance directly. Ammunition was expended rapidly. Heat built up in the barrels. The risk of jamming increased with every second, but the effect was immediate. One fighter attempted to push through the fire anyway. It held course longer than the others, closing distance while firing. Aruth shifted his aim slightly and concentrated. His fire, at this closer range, probability increased. Several rounds struck the aircraft. Pieces broke away from the wing. Smoke appeared briefly before the fighter rolled and dropped out of sight. The remaining attackers disengaged. They did not regroup for a second pass. They did not circle to attack. From a different angle, they broke away entirely, climbing back toward the sun and disappearing from view. The intercom remained quiet. No one spoke immediately. The pilot maintained course. The bomber stream continued forward. Flak bursts appeared intermittently, but no additional fighter attacks developed in that sector. Aruth eased off the triggers. His ammunition count was lower than prescribed. His guns were hot. One barrel smoked faintly. He reported the attack and his firing to the pilot in simple terms. Enemy fighters had approached. He had fired. They had broken off. There was no commentary. The remainder of the mission passed without incident. The bombers reached their target area. Bombs were released. The formation turned west and began the long return flight across hostile territory. Only then did the crew begin to process what had happened. Several bomber crews reported seeing fighters break off unusually early. Others noted tracer fire extending farther than normal from some aircraft. No one could say definitively why the attack had failed. The common assumption was that escort fighters had intervened out of sight. When the bomber landed back in England, ground crews examined the aircraft. There was no new damage, no cannon holes, no fuel leaks. The tail section showed only minor wear consistent with vibration and cold stress. In debriefing, Aruth described his actions plainly. He stated that he had opened fire earlier than regulation range. He stated that he had fired continuously to disrupt the approach. He did not claim hits beyond what he observed directly. He did not argue doctrine. He answered questions and stopped. The intelligence officers took notes. They compared his account with others from the formation. Several gunners reported similar early firing on that mission, though none as sustained. Fighter attacks across the formation had been less effective than average. Losses were lower. This correlation was noted. It was not immediately acted upon. Bomber force was under immense pressure. Missions continued daily. Losses remained high. There was little time to revise training or issue new guidance based on limited data. However, the incident did not disappear. In subsequent missions, some gunners began firing earlier without instruction. Others hesitated, uncertain whether deviation would be punished. Reports became inconsistent. Some early firing appeared effective. Other times it resulted in jammed guns and no deterrence. The variability complicated analysis. Aruth did not promote his method. He did not encourage others to adopt it. He continued to fly missions and followed orders as given. When told to conserve ammunition, he did. When told to hold fire, he did. The event remained isolated. From a doctrinal perspective, the engagement posed a problem. It suggested that timing, not just accuracy, influenced defensive effectiveness, but it also carried risk. Sustained early fire could leave a bomber defenseless if attackers pressed through. The manuals did not change immediately. The war moved faster than analysis. What could be confirmed was narrow and specific. On July 30th, at least one coordinated fighter attack had been disrupted without loss to the bomber. That disruption coincided with early, sustained defensive fire from the tail position. Whether that was coincidence or cause remained uncertain. Engagement had ended without drama. No aircraft exploded. No one cheered. The bomber simply continued on course and returned. What remained was a small deviation from procedure that produced an outcome the procedure itself had struggled to achieve. The consequences of the engagement emerged slowly and without emphasis. In the immediate aftermath of the mission, there was no formal recognition of what had occurred in the tail of Aruth's bomber. Debriefings followed standard procedure. Crews reported enemy contacts, flak intensity, bomb release, confirmation and aircraft condition on return. Fighter attacks were logged as lighter than expected for that sector, but no single explanation was offered. Aruth's early firing was noted, but not highlighted. At squadron level, intelligence officers compared accounts from multiple aircraft. Several gunners mentioned that German fighters had broken off earlier than usual. A few noted that defensive fire seemed to disrupt approach patterns more effectively on that mission. These observations were recorded, but not synthesized into guidance. The reason was structural. Bomber Command was under continuous operational strain. Missions were flown daily. Losses were severe. Analysis focused on aircraft production, crew replacement, and route planning. Small-scale deviations in gunnery behavior were difficult to isolate. Amid thousands of sorties, doctrine moved cautiously. Official gunnery manuals continued to emphasize regulated firing ranges and ammunition discipline. These principles were rooted in engineering limits. Sustained fire over heated barrels. Jams remained a primary cause of bomber loss during prolonged engagements. Instructors feared that encouraging early fire would lead to uncontrolled firing, depleted ammunition, and helpless crews when attacks continued. From an institutional standpoint, restraint remained logical. However, the July 30th mission was not ignored entirely. In the weeks that followed, training officers began quietly observing engagement timing during combat film reviews. They noted that German fighters increasingly aborted attacks when confronted with unexpected defensive fire earlier in their approach. This was not universal. Some attacks pressed through regardless. Others disengaged immediately. The results were inconsistent. That inconsistency limited formal action. Military doctrine depends on repeatability. A tactic that works sometimes but fails unpredictably cannot be mandated across a force. The risk of catastrophic failure outweighed the potential benefit. As a result, no immediate changes were issued. Aruth continued flying missions as assigned. He did not receive commendation. He was not reprimanded. His conduct remained within a gray area. He had violated firing guidance, but he had not endangered his aircraft or crew. The outcome had been favorable. His superiors treated the matter as situational judgment rather than disobedience. Over time, the bomber force adapted informally. Some crews experimented with earlier defensive fire based on conditions. Others adhered strictly to doctrine. Unit cultures diverged. There was no unified shift. The Army Air Forces did not attempt to standardize these variations during the height of the campaign. The cost of experimentation in combat was too high. By late 1943 and early 1944, other factors began to reduce bomber losses. Improved long-range escort coverage altered the air battle fundamentally. German fighters faced increased opposition before reaching bomber formations. The burden on gunners lessened. This shift reduced urgency around defensive gunnery doctrine. Aruth. Action receded into the background. It did not become a case study. It was not cited in training circulars. It did not produce a named tactic. It existed only as part of a broader pattern of adaptation occurring unevenly across the force. From a historical perspective, this outcome was predictable. Institutions prioritize control. They absorb anomalies cautiously. Success that cannot be reliably reproduced is acknowledged quietly and set aside. Aruth did not challenge this. he completed his tour without incident. His service record reflected consistent performance rather than exception. There was no effort to elevate his experience into formal instruction. After the war, he returned to civilian life without public recognition. The engagement itself left little physical trace. No wreckage fell from the sky. No fighters crashed near the bomber. The absence of spectacle made the event easy to overlook. Its significance lay not in destruction, but in absence. The absence of damage. The absence of loss. From the perspective of bomber crews, survival was often measured that way. The mission of July 30th became one of many sorties logged and archived. Its details faded into aggregate statistics, loss rates, mission counts, completion percentages. In the months that followed, the engagement on July 30th remained buried within routine documentation. The mission was recorded as completed. Losses were tallied. The bomber stream reached its target and returned. German fighter resistance in that sector was described as lighter than anticipated. No further inquiry was ordered. Michael Aruth's name did not appear in summaries. From an administrative perspective, there was little reason it should have. He had not destroyed multiple aircraft in a confirmed manner. He had not violated orders openly. He had not altered the outcome of the mission in a way that could be isolated with certainty. The bomber survived. That was all. This reflected how the Army Air Forces processed information. The bomber campaign was measured in tonnage delivered, targets struck, and formations returned. Individual defensive actions mattered only when they could be clearly linked to measurable outcomes. Survival without spectacle was difficult to categorize. As escort coverage expanded later in 1943, German fighter tactics changed again. Attacks became more cautious. Engagement windows narrowed. Loss rates gradually declined. The pressure on defensive gunners eased. When this happened, the question of early defensive fire lost urgency. Training manuals were revised slowly over the following year, but changes reflected broader shifts rather than specific incidents. Improved fighter escort, better radar coordination, and tactical changes reduced the need for bomber crews to rely solely on their own guns. Defensive gunnery doctrine remained conservative. Early firing was still discouraged. Ammunition conservation and controlled bursts remained central. The reasons had not changed. Overheated barrels still jammed. Depleted ammunition still left aircraft vulnerable. Discipline remained the foundation of survival across thousands of crews. Aruth's experience fit uncomfortably within that framework. It suggested that under certain conditions, disruption could matter more than accuracy. But it also carried risks that doctrine could not mitigate at scale. Encouraging deviation without control threatened consistency. The institution chose consistency. Aruth completed his service without distinction. He did not receive decorations related to the incident. He was not interviewed by historians during the war. His actions were never framed as innovation. After demobilization, he returned to civilian life. Like many veterans, he did not publicize his experiences. The work he had done in The Tale of a Bomber over Germany did not translate easily into post-war narrative. There were no photographs, no dramatic confirmation, only absence. The bomber survived. The crew returned. The mission was logged. From a historical standpoint, that absence is the point. Most combat outcomes do not hinge on decisive destruction. They hinge on moments where expected loss does not occur. These moments rarely leave records beyond routine forms and brief remarks. Aruth's decision did not change the air war. It did not rewrite doctrine. It did not spread as a named tactic. It existed briefly at the intersection of observation and necessity. He recognized that waiting preserved procedure but surrendered initiative. He chose to act earlier, accepting inefficiency to force reaction. In that instance, reaction was enough. Once conditions changed, the relevance faded. The manuals endured. The formations endured. The campaign moved on. The engagement that morning passed without drama, without acknowledgment, and without repetition. It remains notable only because it reveals the limits of doctrine when applied to situations it was never designed to describe fully. In the tale of a bomber at 27,000 feet, with numb hands and limited visibility, a single gunner altered timing rather than outcome. The aircraft returned.